I signed my name in the devil's book and all of that, but I couldn't tell you how long. It was at least a month or two. But I went home to visit my parents, who lived in a small farm town like 90 miles from Milwaukee. And I was in my bedroom asleep, and all of a sudden, it's like I felt like I was taken out of my body. And you can say, oh, well, this is just a weird dream. Well, maybe, but I don't think so. And what happened was I was taken out right through the ceiling of my bedroom and out into space. And I was traveling through space at a very high degree of speed. And I came upon, in the distance, I could see, the rings of Saturn. And I landed, or was placed, on one of the moons of Saturn, where you could look, and the planet Saturn, which is enormous, filled the sky. And I was standing there in my PJs, and this guy comes up to me in a white robe, kind of an elderly, distinguished looking gentleman. And he says, come with me. And I turn, and there's this structure that looks so unworldly. It was like made out of black obsidian, like a giant black jewel with weird shapes, and kind of like, almost like something you'd see out of the movie Alien. All this was, I think, before that movie came out. Just unearthly, creepy shapes. And we go into this place, and he says, welcome to the Cathedral of Pain. And I think to myself, this is one weird dream, and I want to wake up. Anyway, I look around, and there's no light in this room. There's just like these huge glass walls on either side. And it's big. I mean, it's like a cathedral, like you might see in a large city. And behind these walls, there's this unearthly greenish light, kind of like an aquarium. And in these walls are floating hundreds of naked dead bodies. Men and women, children, floating there, like they're preserved in, I don't know, formaldehyde. And it was just terrifying to me. And they led me up. There was this altar that looked like it was made out of girders, iron girders. And they took off my pajamas, put me on this altar, and strapped me in place. And then these guys in white, when I say guys, they might have been women too, come out in white, black robes, and they're all chanting blasphemous things, alternating between French and Latin and English, about hail Satan and all this kind of stuff. And it's like they're raising up a level of power, like in witchcraft, which is this is a whole different kind of thing, but they talked about raising a cone of power. Well, they were doing some sort of an invocation. And all of a sudden, at the back of the cathedral, quote unquote, there was this throne. And on the throne, this giant figure appeared. It like scintillated. It kind of like if you were changing the channel on a TV real fast between, at one point it looked like the typical goat of Mendes, the Baphomet thing that now you're seeing with this satanic temple, the goat with female breasts and, the body of a goat and the head of a goat. And then it would turn into this beautiful angelic figure with long blonde hair, androgynous and whatnot. and then it would turn into some kind of a reptilian thing, and it would oscillate back and forth. And the chanting got more and more intense, and I got more and more terrified. And this thing got up off the throne, and it was probably at least 15 feet tall, cloven hooves, and it walked over to this altar where I was strapped on my back, you know, and it had these long talons, and it stuck one of these talons into my forehead, and there the scar is still there. And it was like a red hot poker going into my brain. And of course, you know, the pineal gland is back there, the so-called third eye and all of that. And it just, my brain was like filled with red hot steam. And it was just excruciatingly painful. And he says, now you belong to me forever, body, soul, and spirit. And then with that, he kind of made a gesture like that. And I was flung off the altar, flung through space. And it seemed to me like I was falling to earth in like a fire. And I landed in the backyard of my folks' house. And it was just starting to dawn. And I was laying there, you know, no pajamas. And there was this smoldering thing of grass around me, like that there'd been a fire there. And I staggered back into the house. I had the worst headache I ever had in my life. And from that time on, I was profoundly changed for the worse. But, you know, there was this smoldering thing of grass out there, and there was this hole in my forehead, which I found a Band-Aid to put over because it was, you know, it was bleeding. And I realized that was the Luciferian initiation, which I had been told about, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And that meant I was worthy, quote unquote, to become a higher level Satanist.
Wait a second. I just want to make some clarifications, because you said you were sleeping in the beginning, right? And then you were taken out of your body. But now when you come back and land in the backyard, is that a dream, or is that literally your backyard?
It was my backyard. And I mean, I said it, I felt like I was taken out of my body, but, you know, occult power is occult power. And I don't know how if my physical body left my bed and somehow went through the ceiling of the house and then traveled through space or what. But I do know that what happened in that cathedral, and again, you know, within the occult, okay, there's this idea that if you do something to somebody's astral body, it may or may not have an effect on their physical body. Okay? And that's called psychosomatic magic. And there are all sorts of examples of this in psychiatric literature. So I don't know, because the whole thing was so surreal. And mind you, I was not on drugs. You know, I went home to be with my folks, so I wasn't going to, you know, smoke pot or anything. And yet this weird thing happened that was like worse than any acid trip I'd ever done. And I don't really know for sure, except I know that the thing on the lawn was real, and I know the thing on my forehead was real. I don't know. I mean, I know something happened because it had a profound change for the worse.
Let's actually talk about this, the change that happened in you. So in order to kind of transition into that part of your story, I wanted to kind of ask a question about this. I've heard that at the highest levels of witchcraft, now we're not talking about Wicca, we're talking about extremely high levels of witchcraft to the point that it's so dark that it's probably better to not talk about the things that happen there because it's extremely graphic. But anyway, like at these highest levels, you eventually come to a bottleneck, and this is what I've heard from people, and I just want to know if that was your experience as well. You come to a point where you have to decide between two different paths. I'm not going to go into further detail than that, but is that real? Did you experience that?
Yeah, that happened to me. And I, as you may know, if you watch some of my videos, I was told that there's this 10 stage process of initiation in higher levels of the occult. And I had gotten up to what's called the 7th level, the Adeptus Major. I believe it. I'm kind of rusty on all this. I have a chart of this in my book, Lucifer Dethroned. But anyway, and at this point, you have to cross the abyss, they call it. Aleister Crowley writes about this at great length. And the idea is if you can cross the abyss, you can be on your way to becoming a god. But in a particular branch of Satanism / ceremonial magic that I was involved in, because there are several, I was given a fork in the road where I could either go the route of being like a vampire or being a lycanthrope, a werewolf. And because of things I had heard from friends that were into this stuff, I decided to go with the vampire route because, for one thing, it just seemed more sexy, quote unquote. There aren't many sexy werewolves out there. So that's what I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but that was my personal experience.
Okay, so a lycanthrope is kind of like a somewhat to like a skinwalker. A lot of people in Mexico or Latin America have these witches that do this kind of thing. So this is what you're talking about. And the other one, you said vampire. What do you mean by vampire? Do you mean just drinking blood? Do you mean the literal tale of what vampires are about? Like, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, of course, I never got real far into that because, Yeshua, Jesus intervened, but it was like a cult of beings that were living on blood. And when I chose that path, this entity came to me who I now believe was a fallen angelic being who had a physical body. Just like you see in the Bible, there are angels that can assume a physical form and can, eat and whatnot, like with the 3 angels with Abraham and Sarah in Genesis. But this is, of course, evil. And he gave me these things I had to do, herbs, lots and lots and lots of cocaine, and to prepare myself. And then at one point in the night, he came to me and cut open his chest, had me drink some of the blood, I don't know exactly what it was, within his chest. And then I had to lay down. I had literally made a coffin for myself. And I laid in a coffin for 3 days. And when I came out, I was kind of half transformed into something other than human. And the only thing I could do was either drink blood or, this is going to sound weird as heck, celebrate a Catholic Mass and drink the blood out of the chalice. And that was how I survived. I didn't eat anything for over a year, except that. And fortunately for me, I had a kind of a network of girls under me, young women, who were all parts of because I'd initiated 175 women into the covens that I was the head of. Because initiation, the kind of witchcraft we were doing, is always male to female. If you're a high priest, you can only initiate women, and vice versa. So some of these women were more than willing to have me bite them in the neck and drink their blood. And there were 4 or 5 of them that would do this, and they, alternate so nobody would get particularly depleted by it. And this is going on for quite a while. And at the time, I couldn't go out in the sunlight. So I got a job working third shift for the Milwaukee Sentinel at that time, one of the 2 newspapers. And my job was to put newspapers in boxes, those metal boxes that they have on the street corners, in the middle of the night. And so I'd be doing that by night, and then in the daytime I'd be resting. We had light-proof drapes, and I'd stay indoors and never get near the sun. But gradually it got worse, like any addiction. And I tell people I've got 2 books. Lucifer Dethroned discusses this, and also a more recent book that I wrote 10 years ago or so called Romancing Death, about the whole vampire. I mean, now vampires, there was this crest, of interest in that with the Interview with a Vampire, and then with the Twilight stuff. And, it's kind of faded a bit, but thankfully. But anyway, it's like you need more and more blood. You need more. And I was really having bloodlust, to the point that I'd be driving around in the middle of the night doing this thing with my newspapers. And if I'd see like a hooker out there, or like a homeless person wandering around or something or other, it literally took everything I had to not jump on them and just, kill them. So at that point is when the Almighty intervened with the lady writing the check, and I told that story last time. So he pulled me away from the brink. Praise God. But yeah, that was it was terrifying. People think, oh, it's romantic to be a vampire. Well, no, it isn't. And I never was a full-blown vampire, because what I was told is that when I went through this initiation, and that at some point I would just die and become a full-fledged vampire, and undead. Nosferatu is the Romanian word. And ironically enough, they just came out with that movie a few months ago called Nosferatu, which is based on an not ancient, but a silent film from the 1920s of the same name. So the vampire thing's still out there. I mean, and it's real. And now, like we document in the Romancing Death book, there are nightclubs in big cities where you can go and drink each other's blood. Just like, there are gay bars, there are vampire bars where people will go and, swap blood with one another. And it's regarded as kinky, and it often is a prelude to some sort of perverted sex. And it's becoming huge. And of course, the reason that the Bible tells us, both in the Torah and in the Old Testament, and also in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 15, don't drink blood because it's sacred. The blood is the life. That's actually quoted in the book Dracula by Bram Stoker. That's from Leviticus. and God says it's sacred because the human soul dwells within the blood. You know, in Greek, the word, not Greek, but in Hebrew, the word there indicates that, you know, it's your nefesh, your soul, that's flowing through your veins in your blood. And so you don't drink blood. Now, that doesn't mean if necessary you don't need a blood transfusion. That's different. And we're not like the Jehovah's Witnesses, but it's a curse. And I'm so thankful to Yeshua that he pulled me out of all that. And his power is so much greater. And I didn't understand that at the time because I had this image of this wimpy, you know, Jesus that wore a dress and hung around with sheep, and that was it. You know, I didn't, even though I was raised as a Catholic, I didn't really have any kind of deep understanding of that stuff. So anyway, I mean, I don't know if you need me to say more about that, but you know, it was pretty bad.
Weird.
Yeah, well, you see, first of all, you can't underestimate the power of the demonic. By the time I was doing this initiation, which I believe I was drinking the blood, if that's what it was, of a fallen angel. I was so far into this stuff. I mean, I already sold my soul to the devil, for heaven's sakes. And if you let the demonic totally take you over, dark miracles can happen. I mean, just you look in the Gospels, the idea of the different demoniacs that you see in the Gospel, like the Gadarene demoniac. It says that, you know, he would wander through the tombs and no chain could hold him. And anybody, even now in this day and age, you know, and I hate to refer to the Exorcist movie, but there's some truth in that if someone is really possessed, they can do stuff that totally bends normal human reality. Horrible stuff. And I think, you know, the fact that when I said I was sort of partly human and partly something else, the fact that I didn't eat. If I try, I mean, believe me, I was going crazy for food. But if I try to eat anything, it just, you know, I'd throw it up. Not to be vulgar, but I couldn't eat. The only thing I could eat was blood and water and communion. That was it. And yet I didn't lose any weight. I probably, you know, because if you look at a Catholic communion host, it's like this little tiny cookie of bread that probably has 2 calories in it. And, you know, the wine might have a few carbs in it, and yet I was able to keep going and work a job and function more or less. But I was severely limited, of course, because I could never go out in the sunlight.
This gets to another one of my questions. Isn't blood extremely toxic to the body? How were you able to cope with that?
I don't know that it is or not. I mean, it was explained to me, and of course, this is all by these evil demonic spirit guides, that it's like a virus. Just like you can, you know, get AIDS, you know, from drinking somebody's blood or sexual activities with someone who has HIV. The vampire thing is like a virus. It's transmitted by me drinking that entity's blood. And it may transform me enough so that my metabolism, and this is all theoretical, I don't know. It's certainly demonic, but that I was able to tolerate and metabolize blood. I had never heard that drinking blood was toxic. Maybe it is. I mean, there's obviously reasons why the Almighty says in the Torah, don't drink blood. And James in the book of Acts says, don't drink blood. It's good advice.
Hey, I'm pausing here just to let you know that if you want more details about this testimony, if you're interested, the link will be in the description. You can head over there after the episode is done. All right, now let's get back in the story. Well, okay. Here's something else that I think we have to touch on. just the idea of drinking blood, especially drinking blood from other people, and maybe that's something that I need to ask, like, how would you drink blood from other people? Like, how did that even work?
Basically, what happened with me, and again, this is just me. I was brought into this stuff, and as a result, when I was around people, I could hear their heartbeat from across the room. And I could smell the blood going through their veins from across the room. And it aroused me. But if I got to a point where I was going to, get close enough to the person and like one of these women and they were willing to let me do this, I would get the arousal would be here in my teeth. They would grow and they would become sharp, razor sharp, such that I could, bite them in the neck and the vein and then drink their blood. And you see, let me just give you a sidebar. In the middle of all of this, I had a friend who was a dental student at Marquette, and he said, we need people to practice on for our dentistry. If you want to come, I'll give you a free dental appointment, So I went to him and he started working on me. Now, this was before the whole AIDS thing started. And in those days, dentists did not wear gloves. And he started working on me and he said, this is the darndest thing. My fingers are all numb from your saliva. You have really weird, thick saliva. And so he went and he got gloves because otherwise he couldn't feel, the instruments that he was using. And I had been told that, there's a vampire bat that's a real, animal. It's down in Latin America and elsewhere. And they have a substance in their saliva that's like cocaine. And cocaine is an analgesic if you use it topically. And so when they'll land on like a cow or some other large animal and bite them. And because they have this Novocaine-like stuff in their teeth, the cow doesn't know they're being drained. And something kind of like that was going on in my mouth. And this guy could tell, this dental guy, I mean, he was not any kind of a flake. He was a third-year dental student at Marquette. And he said, I've never had that happen in my life. He said, it's like your saliva is full of Novocaine. And that's a real thing. And so when I would bite these women in the neck, the saliva would numb it so that it was actually an ecstatic experience for them. It was kind of like getting a shot of cocaine into their bloodstream. I never even told that story, but anyway.
Well, I mean, it would make sense that they would come back, because if it was painful, then they wouldn't want to do it. So, I mean, it does explain their willingness to do it. But I think it is really hard to explain. I feel like you probably would have a hard time to actually understand. But one thing that you probably can answer and understand is the reason why you were doing all these things. This is what I wanted to say earlier. The idea of drinking blood from other people is creepy and weird, and most people would never want to do that. You were doing it for a reason, I suppose. Why were you willing to go to such lengths?
Told that if I kept doing this, that at some point the word they used was discorporate. I would discorporate. I would die and live forever as a vampire. Just like, you know, the Dracula figure in fiction, I mean, who was like 400 or 500 years old. And now, in the last 5 or 10 years, this has come out, this whole thing about how some of these elite individuals, this whole thing with adrenochrome and the idea, you know what I mean by that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, the idea that if you get the blood from like an adolescent who's young and full of vitality and whatnot, you get a, you know, you get that blood and you're some old decrepit, you know, creepy Illuminati guy like a Rothschild or a whatever, you know, and you get infused with that blood, you're going to live longer. And all of these people, whether they're the Masons that believe they can have eternal life, like I talked about last time, through pedophilia, or the people that believe they can drink blood, you know, the best thing I was told is to drink the blood of a baby. Because a baby, of course, has a whole life ahead of us. I mean, God forgive me, I never did that. You know, I only drank the blood of young women. But some of these people do this stuff, and they believe that by doing it, they can escape death and they can live forever. And they have been deceived into thinking that by doing these abominable things, all of which are forbidden in the Bible, whether it's cannibalism or blood drinking or other stuff, it's all a deception. But it's very seductive.
Well, okay, so that does explain why you wanted to do that. It was a promise of eternal life, the promise of eternal youth. The idea of it's not necessarily ingesting, but that younger blood makes you younger. I think for a long time, it was kind of a conspiracy, but there's a man, and I don't know the name, but there's a man out there who is portraying everywhere saying that he does that with his kids, that he takes transfusions from his kids, and he uses that, and like he does transfusions to, you know, his own blood to make him younger. So now this is something that is actually being like talked about, although I think he's the only one that I'm aware of that has come out publicly and talk about this.
And they haven't arrested him for it?
No, because it's consensual. So his kids want, like, they want to do it. And so my whole point is, it's weird, but there's something to it. And if you want to look into that kind of stuff, you can look into this guy. I mean, people that drink blood in terms of occult rituals are not going to come out and talk about this, but this is something you readily available on the internet. So,
well, okay, let me just say this. In my book, Romancing Death, I go into the whole, this goes back to the dawn of time, the idea of the vampire, the idea of people drinking human blood. I mean, you know, you go to any culture, you know, in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, even Native American, you know, they all have, of course, it's called different things in different cultures, but it's the idea of a corpse rising from the grave and living on human blood. It's an almost universal human, you know, pathology. And it's demonic, and and in almost all cases, it's rooted in some sort of Baal worship, paganism of some sort, you know. And I haven't heard of this particular guy, but I mean, are these kids of age? I mean, are they over the age of 18? I don't know. I mean, to me, that would be something that I'd send the police out. If he's got a 10-year-old kid and he's drinking his blood, I'd say, yeah,
it is definitely weird.
definitely.
So, to put things into context, how long did you remain a vampire?
Well, I would guess around a little over a year and a half, maybe at most. I mean, you got to realize time kind of was a blur. I never saw the sun, and I was miserable. toward the last 6 months, I mean, between the bloodlust and the fact that I was really, fighting to not kill somebody, and then just the fact that it's boring. I mean, you can't eat anything. I would have died for a pizza. I mean, that sounds funny, but it was somewhere between a year and a year and a half. And then, this lady wrote the thing on the check and started praying for me, and my whole life changed. At first, I thought it was for the worst, but it was like this curse was lifted off me by the power of God.
And of course, that's again in the first interview. So, what happened when that lady prayed for you in detail?
Well, of course, at the time, I thought nothing of it, but at first it was like someone just pulled the plug on me. I felt like, if you could imagine, like there was a hose filling me with occult power through my heel, and all of a sudden, I felt all of this dynamic life force just drain out of me over a period of like one day. And I felt like something a cat dragged in. Like I had things like I could see, people's auras. I could look into their bodies and see diseased organs. And all of this is demonic. It's called radiothesia. And there's whole books on how to do it. And I was able to do that. And all of a sudden it was gone. Totally gone. And plus I literally, when these two girls came to see me with the chick comic books, I probably had to drag myself out of bed and come downstairs to sit in this chair and have them sit at my feet and look at me adoringly. I mean, I barely could. I was so weak because I didn't understand that I had been living on the power of demons for at least a year. And this lady started praying for me, and a lot of that stuff left, not all of it by any means. And I don't know. I'm not able to understand it except kind of in retrospect, and realize that probably at least 70 or 80% of the demonic stuff that was running my life was taken from me by the power of Christ.
What about the food part of it?
That immediately was gone. And I was relieved, because I mean, imagine being in a household where people are making dinner. My wife would be making dinner and whatnot, and we had other people living with us, and everybody was eating, and I couldn't. I mean, it's like being on the world's worst diet. And I'll tell you a secret. When you're a vampire, your breath would knock over a rhinoceros. I had to constantly use like mouthwash and stuff, because you smell like a charnel house. So it's not very romantic. Anyway, yeah, I was able to eat, and that was wonderful. But I thought, well, what happened? In my ego, I couldn't imagine that this stupid Christian lady, praying for me would have anything to do with that. But yeah, I was able to eat, and I was able to go out in the sun. And then within a couple of days, Mormon missionaries showed up at my door.
I want to ask another question about, vampires, because you're probably the only person that I'm ever going to talk to who has experienced something like that. And so I want to make the most of it. Have you ever seen other vampires? I'm curious, because obviously that's not running the streets. I wonder how rare it is. So have you met some of these people?
Well, we prayed for people that were vampires and got them delivered and born again. But you're right, I think there's a lot more of them now than there were when because I was doing this in the late 70s. And between, the whole, like there's literally a vampire convention every year in New Orleans, because that's where Anne Rice was from, the lady that wrote Interview with a Vampire. And it's kind of regarded as like the hub of the vampire culture. And there is a vampire culture. If you go online, you'll find all kinds we got this one couple that were members of a vampire society of some sort, that both were working in a hospital, and they were drinking blood out of the blood bank that was in the hospital. And we got them saved and delivered by the power of Christ, hallelujah. But when I was into all of this, other than this being that let me, drink whatever it was from his chest, no, I never met another vampire, when I was into all of it. I imagine they're pretty rare, because obviously there were hundreds of them running around a given city. It would kind of show up like on the police, and everything.
Okay. Here's something else that I wanted to cover. After having been involved in all these cults, Freemasonry, now, today we talked about even the deeper and darker things that you were involved with the Luciferian initiation, I think you called it. There was a lot of demons, a lot of fallen angels, if you want to call them that, and a lot of people that did not like that you became a Christian. And you said that you had a lot of attempts on your life. Some people in the comments of the last video were talking about how you had experiences with werewolf, and we talked about in the middle part of the interview or whatever that there's kind of a fork, right? You can either become a vampire or a werewolf. So this kind of ties with something that you talked about earlier. What happened after you became a Christian with the werewolf thing? Can you tell that story?
Personal thing that happened to me. Okay. Years ago, there's this one ritual. It's called the Feast of the Beast. It only takes place every 28 years. It's a very high level satanic thing. We were warning people about it, pray, because this is a very big night when they're trying to bring in the kingdom of darkness. And there's a lot of sacrifices being done all over the world. Well, anyway, so I was sitting in our prayer room praying up a storm, interceding for all the people that may or may not have been captured, young people, children, whatever, for this terrible ritual. And very early on, when we started doing deliverance, we always had the practice of laying open a Bible, King James Bible, in whatever room we were using to do the prayers. So it happened that in this room, there was this little table, because you're on the ground floor. And this little table, we had an open, just, Thompson Chain Reference Bible, actually. And all of a sudden, the window exploded. And this werewolf literally comes in the window. Let me tell you, a real werewolf, and now I know they do all this stuff with CGI and all, but they're huge. They're like 6 or 7, well, they're like 7 or 8 feet tall. And this thing came through the window. Paws that were bigger than my hands, and its paws landed on the Bible to get purchased to push itself into the room. And as soon as it hit the Bible, it let out this howl like I've never heard anything like it before or since, but it was just like the thing was in agony, and it literally burst into flames and landed on the carpet and left this big scorch mark on our nice carpet, which I had to explain to the landlord why we had a busted window and why we had this, scorch mark on our beige carpeting. So that was the only time I had an encounter. But my wife, when we were out in Seattle, I was at a conference in Salt Lake, and this is out in the country, and we were living in a parsonage by the Saints Alive compound, which was the Ed Decker's ministry, Saints Alive in Jesus, still is. And anyway, so my wife and her sister were there, and all of a sudden they heard this thump, thump, thump outside the house. It was dark, and they were on the second floor. It's like a split level. And it sounded like a giant walking around. And they opened the blind, and there were these red eyes staring at them from the second story. And she went, because it was trying to open the door. And she went, the old thing, you put a chair under the door, but they were praying. And it paced around the house, it howled, because we were right in the middle of what is called the Issaquah Alps. We lived in Issaquah, Washington. And there were wolves, coyotes mostly. But this thing was howling like crazy, and it was easily 8 feet tall because it was looking in the second story of the living room window. And finally it went away. And the next morning, I was still in Salt Lake, but they called and told me what had happened. They went out and looked, and there were footprints on the ground that they were like this long, over like probably close to 18, 19 inches long, with 3 like pads and then a big pad with a heel. So it's like a giant elongated half wolf, half human footprint that was that big. So that was very real. And we actually took a picture of it and showed that to a local veterinarian who happened to be a Christian. And he said, I've never seen anything like that in my life. It's not a bear, it's not a wolf, it's something totally, other. And this was not personal to me, but because of my background in the occult, I was called in a lot by the police, the Seattle police. And I, in fact, gave training to the police force on occult crime. This is way back in around 1990, I would say. And anyway, they called me in because this incident happened. As far as they know, it was a homicide. And what was the case is these 2 kids, boys, were out on their bicycles, and they were riding around, dumb kids, after dark in a landfill. We called it Mount Trashmore because it was really creepy. And a lot of these landfills, they have fires going, burning off the methane from the decaying trash. And these kids were driving around or riding around on their bikes in this godforsaken place, and they come around this big pile of trash, and illuminated by these fires was this circle of people in black robes. and they lifted up what these kids said looked like the naked body of a young girl and plunged a knife into her. And she screamed, and one of them, the kids, freaked out and screamed. And everybody looked their way, these people in the robes, and all of a sudden, there was this giant wolf-like thing that started coming after these two boys. It was like a watchman. And so the kids were, they took off on their bikes like crazy, pedaling for their lives, literally. And the one kid got ahead of the other kid, and they could hear this thing, flump, 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 like Bigfoot or something, these big, heavy footprints, kind of like what my wife and sister-in-law heard way in the other incident. He said it was chasing them. And all of a sudden, the kid that was ahead of him heard his friend scream, and that was the end of him. And then the thing started chasing the first kid that was ahead, and he was just pedaling for all of his life. And he said this giant claw came around. It was probably twice the size of my hand, and grabbed him by the chest, and he cried out, "Oh, Jesus," at the top of his lungs, and the thing let go like it was scalded. And it left this claw marks on his chest right through his t-shirt. And the kid pedaled home as fast as he could. Of course, his parents, called the police. They never found the first child. And everything was cleaned up. Well, not every, the ritual site was totally sanitized, which is what they do. But they had me go up there and look around, and they also had me look at the child, because he needed like 20 or 30 stitches. And there's these 4 or 5 gash marks on his torso. And I said, it sounds, I hate to say it, but it sounds like there was a lycanthrope, a werewolf that was guarding this particular, site against this very kind of thing happening. And what I was told when I was in Satanism is that basically that's what the function of lycanthropes is to either be assassins or to be guardians of ritual sites. Because if they want to kill somebody, they'll just send the werewolf after them, and people, the police, gee, it was a wild animal attack. And nobody's the wiser. So I have not had any, for that thing with the Bible setting the werewolf on fire, that must have happened at least 15 years ago. And I haven't had thankfully, any encounters since then. I think they're rather rare, the lycanthropes. But I shouldn't probably go into that.
We got to wrap it up because you got to go. But your testimony is, I think it'd be fair to say that it's one of the most unbelievable.
Maybe not, but I talked it over with Ed Decker, who was kind of my spiritual mentor, and also with Jack Chick, who at that time was my publisher. He's since gone home to heaven. And he says, Bill, I think you need to tell the whole thing, because most Christians do not understand the depths of the demonic power that rages beneath the surface of society. Most Christians think we live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. That's kind of a dated reference, but I think everything is nice and all that. And there's a dark, evil force that is simmering, and it's coming out now. It's showing itself. I think partly it's because the level of Christian power in this nation has waned. I think many Christian churches have lost the fire. They have compromised, and it's not the fault of the people. It's the fault of the preachers, because there's an old saying, you know, the pew cannot rise higher than the pulpit. So because of this, and I'm not saying all churches, there's thousands of wonderful churches, but, you know, they have turned into pop psychology. They don't want to deal with the spiritual realm. And I want people to understand that this darkness is real, but that no matter how deep into the darkness you can get, and I was about as deep as you can get, Christ can pull you out. He can redeem you from the very depths of hell. He can redeem you. And that's where I was going. And, you know, people can believe me or not, but I have dedicated my life to proclaiming the gospel and to, you know, speak the truth in love. And as it says in Ephesians 5:11, to expose the unfruitful works of darkness that I myself escaped from. And I know my story is unbelievable, but I've been at this. Well, I started the ministry with Ed Decker in 1986. So it's going on 40 years that I've been doing this. And, you know, it says, by their fruits shall you know them. And we have led thousands of people to Christ. And sometimes, you know, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And my shadow is pretty dark, but the light of Christ shines through, I hope. And I hope people can tell I'm sincere.